Good afternoon. My name is Randolph West. I am presenting today on Linux. Who's heard of Linux? Show of hands. That is 99% of the room knows what Linux is, and one actor. Welcome. You're going to have fun today. Has anybody in the room attended the first two sessions of the Learning Pathway for Linux? That was Hamish 2 days ago, Hamish Watson, and Kellen Gorman yesterday. Show of hands? Okay, that's interesting. It's not as many people as I was expecting, but that's fine because I do cover some of the same topics, but in a slightly different way. My session today will be about managing and monitoring SQL Server on Linux from the command line. And as we'll see as we go through the deck, there are things that do apply to Windows as well. So these might be skills that you may use in your work environment, even though you don't use Linux. We'll get into that. I'm going to ask you to silence your mobile devices. I don't know how many folks have noticed that I had on the first slide a penguin. Yeah, that's called Tux. Tux is the symbol, the ambassador, the representation of Linux. And I have snuck Tux onto every slide to see if everybody's paying attention. In fact, I was so smart, I added some of my slides from this deck to the one yesterday, and I had to remove Tux from a number of slides from yesterday's session on backups because it's not relevant. So please silence mobile devices. There's Tux on the phone. Of course, it's Friday, and if you were here for Kevin's session very shortly before mine, we were talking about everything the PASS has to offer, what it's about. It's Friday. You've seen the slide a number of times. Tux is there on the right, pointing out the fact that there's a lot of volunteers that can get involved. I mean, PASS doesn't pay us very well, but we have a lot of fun. And I'm hoping you've had a lot of fun this week already. This is my slide. It's an about me. There's some things on here you may not have seen before, like Tux. But you'll also notice to the left of Tux is a Windows logo, and to the right of Tux is an Apple logo, because I, like Tux, am cross-platform. And if you cast your eyes next to my name, there's a weird symbol there, and they and them, those are my pronouns. I, too, am cross-platform. So I'm a principal consultant for my own independent company. I've written some books. I am an actor, activist, author. That really means I shout a lot about social stuff on internet and Twitter specifically, so please don't follow me there. There's my handle. And we've got a book coming out called SQL Server 2019 Administration Inside Out, coming out before the end of this year, hopefully. All we did is we changed the 7 into a 9 and added $10 to the price, because there's nothing new in 2019 at all. That's a lie. So this is here because it's supposed to go at the end, but I always forget to show the slide deck once I've done my demos. Please do a session evaluation. If you love me, tell me why. If you hate me, tell me why so that I can do better. The whole point of these evaluations is not to make you feel cool or to win a raffle, which you can, by the way, but to tell us how to improve as speakers. So please don't forget to do that. It'll take a few seconds per session that you've attended this week. So for this session, for those of you who were in Hamish and Kellen's sessions, you will have some awareness of these requirements for this session today. What is an operating system? What is Linux? I say Linux sometimes because I come from South Africa, but that's another story. That's why my accent is a little weird. How to navigate around the Linux file system. Now, Hamish had a very cool slide, which I should have copied, but I didn't get permission, about what the different folder names are. So if you get a chance to get a hold of Hamish's slides, all the var and opt and bin and all those folder names, there's a very cool slide in Hamish's deck that you can go and look at for what they all mean. But I'm just going to show you how to navigate around, like cd and dir and all ls, actually. And then what is bash? Bash is a shell like the MS-DOS shell inside Windows. And we're going to look a little bit at that. And what is a relational database management system? Because we're at a database conference, anything that stores data, welcome, Kellen, anything that stores data is a database. An Excel spreadsheet is a database. A text file is a database. This piece of paper, as soon as I start writing something on it, is a database. But we're here to talk about relational databases and specifically SQL Server on Linux. So let's get into it. I told you, this happened to me yesterday as well, so I'm quite used to this. Give it 5 seconds. There we go. Now you can see those slides, which is awesome. Don't you love live presentations? You know what? This is the spinning beach ball of death, which you don't get on Linux. There we go. I'm just going to mirror my display. Doesn't matter if I can't see what my timer is. I've got somebody to do that for me. SQL Server on Linux on 2017, when it was first introduced, runs on Red Hat Enterprise Linux version 7.3 or higher. SUSE or SUSE, depends how you feel, or if you're German, is SUSE Linux Enterprise Server, or SLES, version 12, Service Pack 2 or higher. Ubuntu. How many folks in the room say Ubuntu? You're wrong. As I said, I'm from South Africa, so is Mark Shuttleworth. Mark Shuttleworth, first African in space, which is kind of a misnomer because he's white, and I mean, seriously, pick something else. But first African in space, but also the creator of Canonical. There it goes again, this is not me. Creator of Canonical, and Ubuntu is a South African word, Ubuntu, not Ubuntu. So please don't say Ubuntu, it's wrong. I love my job. So, and then Docker engine as well. Who's used Docker here for containers? Awesome! That is almost the entire room. What is your favorite feature of Docker? Containers. What is your favorite feature of containers? Why do you use containers? It's fast. That is a very good reason.
It's great for demos, right? Whenever 2019 was coming out, they put out a new CTP every few months, and you don't have to install and uninstall and all that stuff. Docker, you just run a few commands.
It's great for tearing down instances and bringing up a new one almost instantly because it's fast. Yes, because it's self-contained. That's very cool. For those of you who haven't used Docker, it might be cool to look at for development environments, so for DevOps processes and things like that. I would recommend it, and for testing stuff. So today we're going to talk about the installation of SQL Server. It is a one-liner. It's not that hard. Then we're going to talk about configuration with mssql-conf. We're going to do querying with mssql-cli and monitoring with dbfs. Anybody in the room, have you heard of dbfs? Apart from somebody who spoke yesterday during the Linux Learning Pathway, Kellen. Nobody else. It is cool, and I'm going to show you why. So let's get into it. Installing SQL Server on Linux. There are some preparation steps, which I'm not going to cover, but that's how easy it is. You have to tell it where to get the repository from, and if you're using a certain package manager on a certain distribution of Linux, you'll have to use that package manager, but it's install mssql server. And it takes about 30 seconds to 2 minutes because it might have to download it first. If those of you who have installed SQL Server on Windows before know, it's longer than 30 seconds to 2 minutes, even if you have an unattended install. So it's already faster. I'm not going to show you a demo because I'm not going to type a command line. Like, seriously. This is the thing about command line, right? It's not very exciting to look at. So a lot of the stuff that I'm going to do in the demos, I'm going to show you in the slides with nice coloring and stuff first, and then I'm going to do the demos because it's boring just to look at somebody type or copy and paste lines. You may have seen a version of this slide deck before, well, this slide specifically, how did they get SQL Server on Linux? And you will see a whole bunch of stuff with arrows pointing down. I've modified it slightly to show you the different layers of abstraction. So you've got your SQL Server and a tiny bit of Windows so that SQL thinks it's running on Windows. That's how they got it to work. It's very simple at a high level. It's just SQL Server. Then there's a process called the SQL PAL that interacts with SQL Server to the Linux operating system below it. And it just plugs into the OS that way and into the Linux operating system. So you will have two processes every time you run SQL Server on Linux. The first one is SQL Server itself, and the second one is a watchdog process. It's the one that's making sure that SQL is still running. Because if it isn't, it'll try and start it up again. Kind of almost sort of like a service. We're going to talk a little bit about Docker. We mentioned it briefly before. It runs on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. It's standalone, or it can be orchestrated with Kubernetes and OpenShift. We've had a lot of sessions this week about Kubernetes. How many folks were interested in it when you saw a reference to it in the keynote? Raise your hands. That's a lot of people in the room. It's almost a third of people put their hands up. That's cool. Kubernetes isn't for everyone, and we're not going to try and sell it to everyone, but it is very cool for certain things. And for big data, SQL Server with big data clusters is going to be game-changing with data virtualization. So Kubernetes uses containers, which is what Docker is. Docker is a container service. So you can use them together with OpenShift or Kubernetes. And it requires a persistent storage layer. So what's the one thing about containers? If you're tearing them down, your hard drive goes away as well. So you need to have a separate container or a separate network storage location where your database files go. That's the only proviso for using SQL Server on containers. But apart from that, under the covers, Docker containers with SQL Server 2017 and 2019 run on Ubuntu Linux. So it's basically the same. And that's why the commands I'm going to show you today are specific to Ubuntu. There are equivalent commands on SUSE. There's equivalent commands on Red Hat. But today, if you see me typing, I'm going to be typing in Ubuntu. Minimum requirements for SQL Server on Linux, 2 gigs of RAM. How many folks here have tried to run SQL Server on 2 gigs of RAM? Well, I'm going to today. And of course, if you're using Express Edition, it has a memory limit of 1.4 gigs anyway. So, by the way, Express Edition works on Linux just as the same as Enterprise. Did you know that? It's all there. You need 6 gigabytes of storage space. Now, because there are many file systems on Linux, because it is an open source environment and whole world, in fact, our gentleman here with the red hat represents one of those distributions, right? But Ubuntu is a different distribution, and all of them have file systems that are specific to them or shared across the world. Microsoft will support SQL Server on Linux if you are using XFS or the ext4 file system. If you try and use something else, like ZFS, and it doesn't work, sorry, I'm Canadian, not American, so I don't say ZFS. That wasn't me. There goes the screen again. Everybody stay calm. Yes, got it. If you're using ZFS, then you won't be supported, but it doesn't mean it won't necessarily work, but it's not a supported environment. You need 2-core CPU or higher. I recommend 2 cores or higher because if you've ever run a single-threaded version of SQL Server, it's not that fast because it's sharing CPU with the OS as well. Hands up, who knows what NFS is? Almost half. That's network file storage, basically a network share. It's just the way that it's presented to the file system. In Linux, it's kind of like Windows where you can mount a file share to a drive. In Linux, you can do the same thing to a file or a directory path like that. So you can mount your data files and your log files on a network share, just like you can with Windows. And that's what that is. And if you want to know more about Linux in general, there's a link at the bottom for that. Any questions so far? Because I'm covering ground that you may have seen before, but not everybody was in those 2 sessions earlier in the week. Configuration with mssql-conf. I noticed something while I was preparing for the session, that Microsoft changed something between 2017 and 2019. And I'll show you that on a slide, because I had enough time to change my slides. But mssql-conf, for the longest time, there's a command called mssql-conf, and it was storing its files in mssql-conf. And that was confusing. So in 2019, the file is called mssql.conf. You'll see why that matters. So what is mssql-conf, the command? It is, for Linux, it is the replacement for SQL Server Configuration Manager. So instead of having to go into Configuration Manager, and on Windows 10, it's impossible to find because you have to run the shortcut and blah, 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 blah. Instead of doing that, you just run mssql-conf from the command line, and you have almost the same features that you would have in Configuration Manager. It is an instance-level configuration tool. So this is not per database, it's per instance. Cool? It's written in Python, which is another open source programming language. Because it's written in Python, you need Python as one of the dependencies for SQL Server on Linux. Make sense? Yeah, and it is one of the dependencies that is installed for you if you install SQL Server. And it writes to a text file, and I spoke about the text file's name changing. It's fairly straightforward. You issue a command. It takes 2 or more parameters, a setting and a value, and it requires super user administration permissions, obviously, because you're making changes to your configuration. It's the same with SQL Server. When you set it up, you need to install it as a specific user. As the administrator, you will install it, and it gets its own service account. But you do need admin rights to install software on your server. It's the same thing here. This is what it was until I changed my slides. There was the command, which is in /opt /mssql/bin mssql-conf. And then the file was /var /opt /mssql/mssql-conf. But Microsoft came to some sort of understanding that it is slightly confusing having the same thing. So in 2019, the configuration file is now .conf. So it's a little easier to figure things out. I don't know if you can see on the screen the color differences there. I have a bit of a standard here that if I'm talking about a command, it'll be in red. And if I have a text file, it'll be in black. So if you can't see those colors, please let me know. But that's what I'm trying to go through here. So, because on the command line, it's difficult to see when you're just typing. Whenever you make a change to SQL Server configuration, you need to restart. Now, that doesn't mean you need to restart after every time you change something because you're changing 10 things. You need to restart 10 times. So make your changes, then restart SQL Server. It's important to restart SQL once you've made those changes. I'm going to show you some examples, and then I'm actually going to run them in a command line environment, just so you can see how boring it is to look at a command line. Cool? By default, just like on Windows, SQL Server Agent is not starting automatically when you install SQL Server. You have to set it to start yourself. And it's the same with Linux. You issue the command sudo, which is your administrator privilege escalation, if you like, running the command opt mssql-bin mssql-conf, and it's setting a value, which is Sql Agent.enabled, to true. Fairly straightforward, right? So we're just turning on the SQL Agent. This example, yes, let's go back. Yeah? The question is, the question is on Windows, there's a separate service for the SQL Server service and a separate one for the SQL Server agent. And that is the same case here. It's a good question. And in fact, in 2017, I don't remember exactly which CU that had changed, but you had to download the agent separately at one point. So it was rolled up into the product because people were confused about that. So it's available in the product, but you have to turn it on, and it is a separate service. It's a good question. Thank you for asking. So the next example that I'm going to show you is setting the max server memory. No, that isn't the max server memory, is it? Who's paying attention here? How many folks here know Linux? A lot of you put up your hands when I asked that, right? There's a out-of-memory killer in the operating system that will kill any process that is consuming too many resources. So what this is setting SQL Server's memory limit to, in this example, 80% of whatever that I copied from, 80% of the available RAM, so that there's still some overhead for the operating system to have some memory of its own. That is exactly the same as Windows. It's just that memory management on Windows works slightly differently. So how you manage that on Windows is through max server memory. Here, you do it through the memory limit in the configuration, and you can also do max server memory. The max server memory will never get above this number, so you may just want to do it in one place. But it's something cool to know that the out-of-memory killer on Linux is something that Windows doesn't have, and it will just terminate your process without any warning. And you don't want that to happen on a database instance, especially in production. Say again? The default is 80% of available memory. Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for asking. Any other questions about the memory? Yes?
Just a comment that if you're in a real configuration, most often you want to tweak this.
Oh, yeah.
Because
So,
the Linux kernel doesn't consume
right. So it's the same thing with Windows. With Mac server memory, we have a recommendation, right? I have on my own blog, I have a memory server matrix that has a certain algorithm that Jonathan Cahias, who's also here this week, has come through with, and he's created this algorithm that says Windows needs at least these things to run, and the more memory you have, the more memory that Windows needs. And it's the same thing with Linux. It may not need 20%. If you're running a dedicated system, it may only need 5 or 10%. If you're running other stuff, it may need even more. So yes, you do absolutely need to tweak the settings as you go along. This is merely guidance, and that's why it was a good question saying what is the default. It's defaulted to 80% because that's good enough to start with, and then you tweak it up or down. It's a good comment. Thank you. Yes?
I'm backing back to the SQL Agent.
Yes?
If you do the analogy with Windows, what kind of account does it run on?
What account does Sql Agent run under? That's a very good question, and it's the same account that the SQL Server service runs under. When you install SQL Server, it creates a group and a user called mssql. So it's the same as 2012 and higher. It'll create its own service account to run under.
Low-level rights user.
Correct. It's a low-level rights user. That is exactly correct. Now, I do want to interject there and say that on Docker containers before 2019, it ran as root in the Docker container, but that has been resolved for 2019. So I just wanted to mention that because that might be useful information. Now let's talk about trace flags. What I wanted to show here is not that we can set trace flags, but that you can set more than one at a time. Because in SQL Server Configuration Manager, you have to right-click and you create a -tf and then the number, and then you just add them into that. And that goes into the registry. Here you can set multiple trace flags on or off from mssql-conf. So for example here, 3226, if you've attended any of Hamish's sessions, Hamish loves talking about 3226. It removes success messages of backups from your error log. Why do you want success messages in an error log? So 3226, I recommend anywhere. And then 11024, I like this one because it's for statistics. It's got to do with how statistics are managed on large tables. So these are just examples, but 3226 I would recommend turning on anyway. But what I'm showing here is that mssql-conf may take multiple parameters to enable or disable. Any questions about this? Moving on. Who attended the keynote session yesterday morning about information security? That's almost half the room again. Now I'm going to add another question, keeping that first one in mind. How many folks in the room, raise your hands, changed the default SQL port for security reasons? Don't do that. You can change it for any other reason, but not for security. If it's for obfuscation, make sure that that's part of a bigger defense in depth. Because you do not want just to change the port, because a port sniffer will find it in 2 milliseconds. If the only reason you're setting a port is for security reasons, that's not a good reason. If you're changing the port for management reasons, like you have them at certain ranges, that's fine. If you've got a port redirect from a firewall, that's also fine. But if you're just changing it because you don't want to have 1433 open, it's not a great reason. So that's why this example shows you how to unset a value. And here I'm unsetting the network TCP port so that it goes back to the default of 1433. So it's a little bit of a facetious comment there, but this is how to unset something. Any questions about unsetting a port? No? It starts, the question was, does it start off automatically custom? No, it's the default of 1433. But if somebody does change it, this is how to unset it. And unset works for the previous examples as well, right? So you can unset the memory limit as well if you want to. But this is because some folks like to set this port to something else because they think it's going to be more secure, and it's not necessarily true.
I think it's mostly about ranges in Azure, and people just, Microsoft not even wanting to see the port, just hit on.
Yeah, and for that, that's a management reason. That's a good reason. So the gentleman said that in Azure, for example, Microsoft may not want to see traffic hitting 1433 on all their IPs, so they may manage it in a different way by having a higher range. And that's perfectly acceptable. But if your sole reason is turning 1433 off and setting something else because you heard it was secure, that's not a great reason. Now here we have how to view the configuration. Now remember, in 2017, you're going to have, and I don't know if this is going to work, but I have this fancy device that's supposed to show me oh, there it is. I'm highlighting the period here, the full stop, because in 2017, that's a hyphen. It's a dash. So this is only on 2019 where you'll have the dot, but that's important to keep in mind. This is the file where mssql-conf writes to. So I had the previous slide which showed you the paths of everything. This is the path where it's writing to. And then you can view that using the superuser command cat. So what's cat? And I've got a little hint at the bottom there. It means catalog. It means print out what's happening inside the file. It doesn't mean catalog. It means concatenate. I've, in fact, mistaken myself. So I'm wrong. There, I fixed it. Cat means concatenate. I always say catalog. Cat means concatenate. That's why I have it on the slide, because I always get it wrong. You see? See? And what does that look like? Well, here's a very basic example that I've overlain on the slide. And I've done some highlighting because this is an INI file. Anybody remember programmanager.ini? Program.ini from Windows 3? It's an INI file. And there's a section heading in capital letters, well, not necessarily, but in square brackets, and then a value and a setting and a value. And that's what you're doing with that Python application. You're just setting values, and then when SQL Server starts up, it reads these values. I am an MVP, and I do have access to certain information, but this is not that information. This is my own personal thought. I think SQL Server on Windows is going to head this way eventually. This is my supposition. That is not based on any information that I have. But I think we're heading to the point where you will be able to deploy SQL Server on Windows in a very similar way to the way you do it on Linux. That is my belief. Any questions about the INI file that is? Yes, I didn't see you there.
So for your file locations,
Yes.
would those supersede anything that's stored in master database?
Can you repeat the question?
Would they supersede, because those will obviously get set in the master database, wouldn't they? Would they supersede it?
So the question is, because my example here shows the default file locations of certain things, right? So you're asking, wouldn't the master database supersede where those locations are? There is no priority. It'll just be whatever's in the database. But to get to the master database, you still need to go somewhere to find it. Yes. So yes, you would go to master first, and that would be marked here. Because if you remember in Configuration Manager, if you go into the properties of your service for SQL Server, you will see the paths of tempdb and model and master and all those things. This is the equivalent of that. It's a good question. Anything else? Yes.
This file, if it resides on the same place, even in a Docker container or something in the system.
Does this file reside in the same place, for example, in a Docker container?
And then a following question, can I edit this file here?
And can I edit this file? So on Docker, you would use environment variables instead of this file. Have you ever spun up a SQL Server instance with Docker?
Yes.
And when you do that, it says Docker run, and then there's a whole bunch of commands, including the I agree to the EULA. That, you'll see at the top of this page, there's the EULA as well. But you would do that with those environment variables when you create the container, and you would do it through environment variables on Docker. It's just easier to do. And I don't believe you can edit this file on Docker. But yes, you can. If you create your own image, yes. If you create your own image, then yes. But if you use one of the images that are available right now, then you would do it through environment variables. I would encourage using environment variables for Docker anyway. It's just a different management technique. Good question. Thank you for asking. Anything else about the?
On an ordinary Linux machine,
Yes, on an.
then I can edit this on inside the file.
Correct, and that's why I gave you the path as well. So you can concatenate, you can show what the output was. You could do nano or vi here instead of cat, and you would still be able to edit, manipulate the file, and make changes. But remember, this file is locked when SQL Server is running. So if you want to make changes, you need to make sure that SQL Server is stopped before you make those changes. And in fact, if you try and make changes using mssql-conf while SQL is running, it will stop you from doing that. You have to have stopped it first before you can make the changes. If you want more configuration options, you can go to this URL. It's very easy to find with your favorite search engine. I'd encourage you to have a look. There are a lot. I will show you because I'm about to go to the demo now, which is just a couple of commands that I've already shown you, I would encourage you to have a look at that page as well, because there's a lot of information. And remember, did you remember to restart SQL Server after making changes? Fairly simple. For Docker containers, and this is again because of the environment variables, it's better to restart the container as opposed to restarting SQL Server. Because you'll be, not Docker itself, just the container. So you would stop the container and start it again. Any questions? Can I show you just a couple of command lines? I'm going to copy and paste from a text file. Yes, yes. So because of Docker is an abstraction layer from the operating system. So unlike a virtual machine where you've got, it thinks it's a physical machine, so you have to install the operating system, you have to install the drivers, you have to install a whole bunch of things. A container abstracts away the operating system, so it thinks it's already running on, in this case, Ubuntu Linux. So it makes some suppositions, some guesses about the environment that it's running on. And so it's easier to restart because you're using environment variables to set configuration values to just restart the container because those configuration values are set when it starts up. You're welcome. So let me go and try and see if this works without breaking the screen, shall we? Oh, good times. Clear. Can everybody see that at the back? Okay, just for the sake of this discussion, I am running Ubuntu Linux 18.04.3 long-term servicing edition. This is running in the background. What I'm using is a secure shell connection to this virtual machine from my computer so that I can copy and paste commands. I could type these commands directly into the console on this virtual machine, but it's difficult to do that with copy and paste, and I don't recommend doing that anyway. You do want to make a secure shell connection. And I am also going to sit down because it's a little tricky to do this standing up, so if you don't see me, it's okay. I'm still here, I promise. So you'll notice that I'm using a Mac, and I have a product here called Visual Studio Code. How many folks in the room use not Windows? This is the new Microsoft. I like this world. You have choices. So this is Visual Studio Code. It's just a text file. I could have used TextEdit, but I'm just showing off the latest and greatest. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to take this first command, which is setting the SQL agent on. So I'm turning the SQL agent on in the configuration. Remember, it doesn't do anything until I restart SQL Server, but I'm just showing you what's happening there. So I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to go into here, which is my secure shell connection to that virtual machine that I showed you, and I'm going to paste. And now it's asking me for a password. Why is it asking me for a password? Sudo. It's an administrator account. So PASSWORD. Yes.
What account is the SQL agent running under?
That question was raised earlier in a different way. The account is running under an account that was created when SQL Server is installed, and it's called mssql, MSSQL. And the agent will run under the same account. Now you'll see I have a little message that says the environment locale is not supported because I'm Canadian. And I'm lazy. I don't care about that. I don't want to fix it. So please ignore that message. As soon as I get back to Canada, it goes away, and I cannot explain it. You must know I'm here. What did I do? I said sudo opt mssql bin mssql-conf set SQL agent.enable true. And as soon as I did that and typed in my password, it said SQL Server needs to be restarted in order to apply the setting. And then it tells me how, which I think is pretty cool. Obviously, I'm going to need to type in my password if I take too long, but that's telling me how to restart SQL Server if I need to. But because we're going to do a couple of things first, we don't need to restart it right away. So the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the memory limit to 3328 megabytes. And
But your SQL Server is not up and running now.
that is correct. Somebody's paying attention.
How can you restart it when it's not up and running?
Somebody's paying attention. How can I restart it if it's not running?
It was started yesterday.
Somebody's paying attention. Okay, I'm gonna jump out of my script. I'm gonna jump out of my script here quickly. When you first start SQL Server, when you first install it, you need to set it up. It is running.
So how can you change the file? Eller how can you, yeah, you can write the file with the command, but you cannot edit the file.
Maybe you can in 2019, because it may have changed, and I may be wrong again. And in that case, we've all learned something new today.
I'm going to try that.
And I'm going to own that. That's your homework, and I expect to see a blog post from you.
Yes.
And I will point to it on Twitter. And I think I have 63 followers, and I will point them all to your blog post.
That's great.
So as it turns out, you don't need to stop SQL Server to make an edit here. You just need to do it for the setup. So that's something we've all learned today. Thank you for that. So the next example that I've already taken you through the slides is setting 2 trace flags. And that is, again, as simple as just typing in mssql-conf, trace flag, 2 values, on, and done.
Is it a maximum memory limit or?
If you remember when I mentioned earlier, there's an out-of-memory killer on Linux. So if SQL Server uses too much, it's just going to kill it and not warn you about it. That's separate to the max server memory setting. But on Linux, you might get away with not having to set the max server memory limit like you do have to on Windows, because it will never get higher than that value. So it's a good question. Yes? Can we exclude the SQL Server service from the out-of-memory killer? I would not do that even if I could, because you may reach an environment where you might think that it is excluded and it isn't, and you might make an assumption that is incorrect, or it's not part of your regular configuration and somebody else who takes over from you won't know about that. And it could cause out-of-memory conditions. Yes, sir?
You can certainly create more swap space than you really need, and then you will never run out of memory, but you
Right.
will run really, really slow.
So the gentleman said you could always increase your swap space to prevent that from happening, but then everything slows down. So there's always a trade-off. I wouldn't try and exclude it just to get that little bit of extra memory, because that doesn't make sense to me in terms of the rest of managing that instance. It would make it harder to manage over the longer term. So all I'm going to do now is I'm going to restart SQL, because it keeps telling me to do that. So I'm going to copy this command, because I'm lazy and I never type in a demo. And SQL, how long does it take to restart SQL Server in Windows? The same. It's the same code. I promise you, it's the same code. I don't have any databases on this instance. That's why it was quick. It is the same speed. It is the same code. It's the same product. Everything's the same. That was a trick question, and I don't like asking trick questions, but every now and then we have to, right? Do you think this is going to work? Yes. Yes.
So I noticed it didn't give you the restart warning for the trace flags.
It did. It did. Oh, you're right. It didn't.
So does that mean that you can change those trace flags without restarting?
It may just be that because I've already received the warning several times, I don't know. That's a good question. I think we have another blog post. Say again?
Could it be that you already set them when you rehearsed?
Could it be that I've already set the trace flags when I rehearsed this demo? It is possible, but I also did the other 2 settings at the same time, and that didn't ignore the setting. Yes, at the back.
So some of the settings that are available, you don't actually need to restart SQL Server.
Some of the settings that are available, you don't need to restart SQL. We are all learning here today. Thank you for raising that.
Network shares are one thing that are loaded in dynamically. So if you set a batch network share in SQL Server, then it will just pick that up.
So network shares, as well as apparently trace flags, are those settings that you don't need to restart SQL to modify. Thank you for sharing that. Do you work for Microsoft?
I do.
A Microsoft employee coming to see a session about their product. I hope I'm teaching you something. That's cool. Let's see if this Alt-Tab works again. The next thing we're going to do, and Hamish covered this very briefly before, is mssql-cli, or the command line interface. This is a Python tool, we'll talk about this a little bit, that almost but not quite replaces Sqlcmd. Raise your hands who's used Sqlcmd. I'm so sorry. Okay, I'm going to ask this, and I don't want you to raise your hands, even if it's true. How many people still use OSQL? Good, nobody raised their hands. Sqlcmd was the replacement for that. How many folks are still using Sqlcmd today? How many if needed. How many folks are using Sqlcmd because they need to do scripting against the database, and this is a very efficient way to do it? That's generally the use case. It's about a quarter of the room who raised their hands for that, maybe a little bit less. I've got the almost in brackets there because it's not quite a good replacement just yet. There's one little thing that's missing. But I think for most use cases, if you do not have access to Management Studio or a user interface environment like Windows or Ubuntu Desktop or Mac, then it's very cool for a command line interface, and I'll show you why. I'll tell you when we get there. Is there a DAC? Of course, it's SQL Server. The question was, is there a dedicated admin connection? And the answer is yes, it's SQL Server. You have to enable it on the instance level. It's not in the ini file because it's inside SQL Server. Remember, there's configuration manager equivalent, and then there's instance level inside SQL Server, and that hasn't changed. Everything inside SQL Server is still inside SQL Server. So it replaces Sqlcmd almost. It's an interactive command line query tool. Interactive meaning it responds to you. It's written in Python, and it has full IntelliSense support. No more typos. Who's happy about that? Because I know I am. I make mistakes all the time. It has autocomplete. Yes. It has syntax highlighting. I think that's cool. It's easy to see what's happening. It remembers your query history. So if you've typed a command and you just want to remember what you typed, you can go back in the history, just like you can on Bash or any other shell, and see what you typed. It has configuration file support, so you can modify the session to be the way you like it. And the reason I say that is because it has Emacs support or VI support. If you are an Emacs person, you can set it up to run in a way that you like it with Emacs. If you like VI, then you can do it that way. That is cool, I think. And multi-line queries. In Sqlcmd, until you type the word go, it's just considered one query. The default is not multi-line. You have to turn that on with a function key, but it's really simple, or you can set it up in your configuration. And so you can do single-line queries or multi-line queries without needing the go command. Any questions before we get into a little bit more? We had a question about what's missing. You know the input file for Sqlcmd? You can ask for an input file with -i. It's not there. You can do a -q, which has a tsql query in quotes, but it's not a file. It's not an input file that you can use. That's what's missing. But I think it's only a matter of time before they get there. Any questions before we go forward? Yes, it is. It's Python. So it'll run on anything that runs Python. Who asked the question? You did. Is it cross-platform? Yes, it is, because it runs on Python. There are something called named queries. So if there are queries that you run frequently and you just want to call them up with a shortcut, you can do that. So there's a command, there's a / command, sn, which saves the name, sn. It's quite simple. The name of the query and the query itself. And then to call it back, you just say /n for name, and it runs the query. This is very useful for if you've got a bunch of diagnostic scripts that you like to run regularly, and you can do it from mssql-cli. It has a bunch of special commands. This is just a subset because I don't want to bombard you with information on a slide, and these are a few ones that I think you might find interesting. /, list everything, because there's only 3 here. So if you want to see them all, /, done. /d describes the objects. I like that the fact that they use the word describe here, because I have a little story. I used to be an Oracle DBA before I moved to SQL Server, and first SQL Server I ever used, I typed the word describe, and it didn't work. And I didn't know why. And I learned about something called SP help, and SP help index, and SP help text, and all these things that just didn't make sense to me. So it's interesting that the word describe is used here, and it calls SP help, because it's trying to take people who are familiar with RDBMS systems on Linux to make the change over to SQL Server at 1/10 the price. Was that my out loud voice? This next one is kind of the working fix for the fact that it cannot take input files. You can take your script and you can edit it in an external editor. So if you have a long script that you want to page through and you don't want to do it inside mssql-cli, you can take it out of there, put it into VI, into Nano, into whatever you use, and edit it there, and then bring it straight back in again. It's a temporary object. It'll just push it back in again. I'm not going to show you all of those features because we don't have time, right? But I'm going to show you some. And then this is cool here. You can do list databases. You don't need to go and say select star from sys.databases. And you don't have the Object Explorer on the left like you do in Management Studio and Azure Data Studio. So you can just do LD, list databases, LT, list tables, LI, list indexes. And there's a pattern, so you can pattern match against the text values. So you can filter the stuff that you want to bring back. This is very cool. This is a lot of your work that you normally would do in Management Studio, spin up a Windows instance or connect remotely, you can do from the command line using this tool. The plus in brackets is verbose mode. Shall we show you this? I'm not going to show you a bunch because of time, but I'm going to show you some. Any questions before we get into it? Is it stable?
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
I tried it 2 years ago when it was launched on PAS.
0.15 was released recently, and it is stable. It's cross-platform. The question was, is it available on Windows? The answer is yes, because it's a Python tool, so you can download it using the Python. I'm sorry, I didn't hear it. Sorry?
This is very similar to Postgres pre-SQL command.
It's similar. It's similar to Postgres. It would be similar to Postgres because Postgres is also a SQL NC compliant engine, yes. So it would be, yes, because it's similar in that because it's trying to get people who are familiar with Linux backgrounds, yes. So it is similar to Python as well. So how do I open mssql-conf? mssql-cli? Never type in a demo. It assumes that I'm connecting as SA, and it would be correct. I've just pressed enter. Now I'm going to type in my long, complicated password. P-A-S-S. Is it D or T at the end? Password. I may have made a mistake in my typing because this happens from time to time. Because it's actually not password, it's another password, and I always joke that it's password, but I'm typing something else in the background, and it's probably not going to work because we're in a demo. Oh, it worked! Woo! That was intentional. So let's see if this button works here. So I'm going to hover over this. 0.15 came out recently because I was on 1.3, and I updated to 1.5 last night. So it's being updated periodically, and it is stable, in my opinion. Now, the version that Hamish demonstrated was a previous version that says hello and goodbye when you open and close it. This one doesn't do that. It's more pro. I'm not going to say that. I'm just repeating what you wrote. So at the bottom of the screen, you will see F2 for smart completion. You may not want to turn that on because it might slow you down because you may be a demon at typing and you don't care about smart completion. So you can turn it off. I wouldn't, but that's because I'm clumsy and I type with 3 fingers. F3, which is grayed out slightly, which means it's disabled right now, I can turn on multi-line queries, or I can just do single line. Currently, it's in single line mode. And then F4 is for Emacs mode. That is the default right now. The other one is VI mode. Anybody in the room have an opinion on which is the better editor? Question? VI only. No comment. Because this is a SQL session and not an editor session. So you'll notice I've been dumped at a master prompt. That just means I'm in the master database, which is regular because you're connecting to the database. If I put in a /d in my command line to get into mssql-cli, because I can do a -u for my username as well, I can go straight into that database as well. So it's kind of similar to Sqlcmd in that respect. So let's do a \? To show me the special commands. Ooh, look at that formatting. Ooh, it's not just a dump of text with all sorts of weird and wonderful widths because there's not enough space. Say again? Enterprise. Yeah, this is Enterprise Pro Edition. So you'll notice there at the top, record number 1, it says command/d, and the shortcut is /d object, and it'll list or describe database objects, and it calls SP help. That's exactly what I said in my slide. I can also delete a named query, because remember I showed you the named queries, save named queries /sn. This is how to delete one. I can edit the query with an external editor. I can list databases. So let me just show you.
Can I use dashes instead of backslashes?
Can I use dashes instead of backslashes? I don't know, and I doubt it. You can in a lot of Windows commands, but I'm not sure. You would have to test that. And then write a blog post and send it to me, and I will forward on to my 65 followers because I picked up 2 while I was speaking. So let's list the databases on this instance. And I'm going to do a plus. And there's my verbose information for the databases on this instance. And because it's a fresh instance of SQL Server, I got the master, tempdb, model, and msdb. Nothing exciting there, but look how nicely it's laid out. And because I'm using a very big typeface so that you can all read the screen, it is doing it in this format. If you had more screen real estate, so if you had a smaller typeface and you were working on a 17-inch monitor, then this would be laid out slightly differently. So it does adapt to your screen, which I like a lot. So let me go back to my text file and see what my examples were. That's what I just said. So yes, if you have a bigger screen, the question was, can I change it from this format to record format regularly? Yes, you can, as long as you have a bigger screen and smaller text. It's because I'm using such a big typeface for these demos. So yes, the default is wide mode, so you will be able to see those. Yes, question?
So what is the compatibility level for master 140 and the other 140?
Laurie asks, why is the compatibility level in the master database set to 140 on a SQL Server 2019 instance? And Laurie, there's a Microsoft employee in the room. I think you should go and ask him. That is a good question. You know the rule. You know the rule. If the presenter says it's a good question, it means I don't know. If I say it's an excellent question, I do know the answer. And if I say it's a fantastic question, I have a slide for that. It's a good question, Laurie. So I'm just gonna scroll down here. We've already listed the commands. We've described the objects. I'm not going to run through this. But these are some of the commands that you can do. So I'm going to do show me, because it's a fresh instance, I want to show me just the databases with an M in the name. So it's going to show me model master, right? So LD plus and then an M. Did you see how IntelliSense came up because it thought I wanted to do something? Wasn't that cool? Yeah, because there's an M in tempdb. Well spotted. Your name must be Derek. Derek says it's been a long day. So that's mssql-cli. I think it is pretty close to replacing Sqlcmd in a lot of respects, especially if you have to use the command line to interface with SQL Server, and if you don't have access to Management Studio or Azure Data Studio. Because as you know, it's just SQL Server. You can connect to it using any client.
Is it self-contained? Can I take the code, like put it in a file and just put it there?
Are you asking about SQL Server itself?
The Python written stuff. You need Python.
You need a Python command. You need a Python framework to be running to install it. Yes. It is open source, and you can contribute to the GitHub repo, yes. You don't need a Python repository, but you do need Python installed on your machine. Yeah, the Python framework. But because I'm running it on the same machine as SQL Server, I'm just remoting into the SQL Server instance, then it's installed there already because it's needed for some other features of SQL Server. How are we doing for time? When did I start? 2 o'clock? dbfs. Now, I am aware that I'm at a conference sponsored by Microsoft. I'm also aware that I have an MVP, which is an award. I didn't deserve it, I earned it. So it is very easy for me to say things that could get it taken away from me. I'm about to say one of these things. Microsoft tends to abandon technology from time to time, for budgetary reasons mostly, because some customers don't need it, right? This is a feature that has been abandoned, and I'm telling you that because it's a shame, because it is amazing technology, and I'm going to show you why. dbfs is a clone, if you like, of another thing that allows you to connect to competing products. So like Postgres and Oracle might have something similar, right? And MySQL and MariaDB. dbfs has been abandoned, which means nobody's updated the repo in 2 years, right? I'm telling you this so that you have full awareness of this before you use it, but I use it today in a production environment because it is cool. I'm going to show you why. dbfs, database file system. Imagine in a world, I'm an actor, by the way, in a world where you could just go into your command line and just run DMV queries without using Sqlcmd or mssql-cli. You can just map the DMVs directly to your scripts. How about JSON outputs for the results of those DMV queries? Okay, that doesn't sound cool until you see it. DMVs are a user-spaced file mapping thing. That's the technical term. It uses Fuse to create an interface between the DMVs that you're familiar with, your dynamic management views, and Bash, which is your shell. So when I connect into my database instance and I want to look at DMV values, as long as I've set up dbfs, I can go and query the DMVs just by reading the file, using whatever, cat, less, more, whatever the case may be. And I'm going to show you some examples. And again, it's very boring looking at it on white text on a black background, so I'm going to show you in the slides. Who here in the room has used the command grep? Okay, the answer is at the bottom, so if you read quickly, you can tell me. Who here knows what grep means? It's much fewer. So in the original question, most people put up their hands. They use grep a lot. I use grep a lot. It stands for globally search a regular expression and print. In other words, it takes output from somewhere. Usually it's piped in. That's what the pipe is for. It's taking the output from ls and searching through it, looking for a string, and it's doing it twice in this example. It's looking for OS and looking for memory. So I'm looking for a DMV containing the words OS and memory. Very simple there. Why do we care about that? I will show you. Stay tuned. Now that we've found the DMV we're looking for, which is dmos_sys_memory, there is the file, and then there's a .json equivalent of that file. And then using Python, because it's already installed, because you need it for SQL Server to install, you can use the JSON tool and prettify it. So you can make your JSON DMVs look pretty. And then because you're looking pretty, you've got tabs and line breaks and all that kind of stuff. Then you can use awk, AWK, to go and collect information from that output. So you can get DMV information in whatever format you like almost instantly from the command line without logging into SQL Server directly. Didn't I say this was coming? So I'm asking awk to print the first and the fifth column from the output of dmos_sys_memory in tabular format. Can you repeat the question?
What user does it run as?
What user does this run as? This is you. This is you running as you, because what happens is when it's a user space file system, so you can connect using your credentials as long as you have access to view the DMVs. So when you create the connection using the dbfs configuration, you will provide a SQL username and password in a file, and that is what's used to connect to SQL Server and map these DMVs for you. How about this one? This is quite a complicated command line, but of course this is in a script, so it doesn't matter. But this is extremely powerful. I can go into the dmexec connections, and then I can sort it one way, and then I can sort it in reverse, and I can figure out who is connecting, and I can get columns 1, 16, 17 from the first set, and 5 and 8 from the second set, and join it all together into a format that is nice and pretty. Do you want to see it? I think some people in the room are interested in seeing this. I'm going to sit down at my computer. I'm going to open up the command line. I'm going to type exit from mssql-cli. There it says goodbye, but it stops saying hello. I think if you ask nicely, it'll say hello. So I'm going to tab into my Visual Studio Code, where I have some commands that may look very familiar to you who have been paying attention. So ls, what does ls mean? It means list, right? So ls, well, that's not much use. So I'm going to have to go into the folder that is mapped to the DMVs, which I'm going to do right now. Say again? Say again?
How do you map a folder to a DMV? Is there a practical on that?
There is, so the question was, how do I map the DMVs to a folder? There is a tool that you need to download and install called dbfs. Then there's a configuration file that you have to configure. And then in there, once you run the dbfs command, then it will create the mapping. I've not done those steps because I want to show you the output, and because of time mainly. But yes, there is an... Yes, and you can play with it as much as you like, yes. So I'm going to go into the demo folder, and I'm going to do ls again. Oh, look, reset dbfs. Let me run that. Do you think it's going to work? Set dbfs.sh. Do-do-do. Do-do-do, reset. For everyone paying attention at home, this worked an hour ago. So the question, I have a question. It's a real question. How many folks in the room have one of the new MacBooks? How many people are struggling with the keyboard? Because I'm struggling with the keyboard right now. Okay, I'm sorry. Shall we see if this works? Okay, cd DMV server. Oh, it worked! Do those look familiar to people who are familiar with SQL Server DMVs? I'm not going to scroll through the whole list. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my predefined statement here, and I'm going to look for DMVs with the words OS and memory in them, and I'm going to paste that because I'm lazy. And there are all the ones that came back. Isn't that cool? And you'll notice each DMV has a .json equivalent. Then I'm going to go back to, hopefully, I'm going to go back to my code, and I'm going to get these two. So the first one I'm going to look at is just the regular file, and there's the result set as if I were doing select star from that DMV inside SQL Server. But that's not easy to read. So let's do the same thing with the .json. So I'm going to go up, .json. And there it is in JSON format, but it's also difficult to read. So let's prettify it. How many folks have used a prettifier for their code? It makes things so much easier. So let's see how that looks when it's prettified. Oh, look at that. That is as if I typed select star from that DMV directly inside Management Studio or Sqlcmd. You can send it directly to Grafana. You can send it to any time series database. You can live update if you want. As long as you can as long as you can read from that file, you'll be able to get these results. The question was, how do you do this on Windows? And the answer is, for those of you who can't see me, I'm putting up my hands. I don't know. It would be nice on Windows, wouldn't it? So here we're going to do that awk command. So what that's going to do is print the first and the fifth column of that query, and it's going to do tabular formatting. And with any luck, there it is. It's the first column, which is total physical memory KB, and then the system cache KB, and those are the first and fifth columns, and it's in tabular format. Cool. Do you notice how quick it is? I mean, it's longer for me to talk and copy and paste and all that kind of stuff. It requeried. The question was, does it requery or is it a memory? And the answer is it requeries every time.
But is it the DBFS who creates those JSON files?
DBFS is creating the JSON abstraction. I've got a room monitor in the back who's had her hands up for so long telling me there's 10 minutes left, and I thought I'd acknowledge, so thank you for that. She's fabulous. So what did I do there? I did that long join command that you saw on the slide, and it's getting column 1, 16, and 17 from the first result set, and columns 5 and 8 from the second result set, and just jamming them together. And there, in a nice formatting, is session ID, client address, TCP port, protocol type, and encryption option. Simple. Very, very powerful stuff. Usually when I start talking about DBFS, people go, why? And then I say, why not? But I remind you that it has been abandoned. Nobody's updated it in 2 years. But it does work on 2019. So this command is taking it's querying the dmexec connections twice and joining them together using a built-in Linux command called join. And it's taking the two result sets. This is just an example. It's not a great example, but it's an example of showing stuff that is already built into Linux that you can now apply to SQL Server.
So you can do any queries remoting to DBCS?
As long as the question was, can you do any query? Yes, you can, because DBFS also allows you to use custom queries as well. So that's something that I didn't mention, because that was my one more thing. So thank you for spoiling for everyone. I'm kidding. You can do custom queries as well as DMVs, which I think is pretty cool. That is a fantastic question. It is a fantastic question, yes. No, not at all. Please, thank you. One more thing. This is not the one more thing that I'm going to tell you. The one more thing is that you can use Dba Tools on Linux as well, as long as you're not using WMI, which is Windows Management Instrumentation. If you rely on WMI for some of your things that Dba Tools does, they will not work, but that leaves about 70 to 75% coverage for everything else that Dba Tools can do. So I was able to do a lot of stuff last night while I was testing, which I'm not going to show you, because you've seen Dba Tools sessions at this conference, have you not? Get Dba disk space. Do you know what? We have some time. Should we try?
Because I have to rewrite that, and I can only use TCP between my domains. I think it uses WinRM.
If it uses WinRM, then it's likely that it won't work. All I'm hearing is that you have a blog post. That's what I'm hearing. So the gentleman was saying, for those of you listening at home, there are some commands that may not work, and this is a very good example of one. Dba disk space is probably not going to work because it relies on certain Windows functions. The question was, are there any prerequisites for Dba Tools to get it to install? The answer is PowerShell. And the answer is also PowerShell runs on Linux, it runs on Mac OS, it runs on Windows. And PowerShell Core is the new way of doing things. So PowerShell for Windows stopped at version 5.1, I think. And PowerShell 6, and I think 6.2.3 is the latest release. It runs on cross-platform. And I think PowerShell 7 is in preview mode already, PowerShell Core, if I'm not mistaken. So you can run PowerShell as well to get DBA Tools to work. And of course, DBA Tools has over 500 commands. I'm just going to read the slide. Over 500. I think people in the room know DBA Tools, right? Raise your hands. Who's heard of DBA Tools? Most of the room put up their hands because they've heard of it. Have you used it? Raise your hands. It's a little bit fewer, but it's a very, very cool set of tools to use alongside mssql-cli, to use alongside dbfs, and maybe even with them. Are you here to tell me 5 minutes? Yeah. So I'm going to take my rule about never typing in a demo, because you've already seen me fail once at it miserably. Let's see if get DBA disk space works. It's probably not. How do I install DBA Tools? I'm going to guess that it's install-module space DBA Tools inside a PowerShell prompt.
But when you do that, you can just install the SQL Server module also.
The SQL Server module, the SMO objects, is installed with DBA Tools now. It's included with them. Did you know that? Oh, I did teach you something in my session. If I had the mind-blown emoji right now, I'd do it. There were conflicts before, yes, but SMO is now included in DBA Tools by permission, but it is included, yes. And I say high coverage here because it's changing every day. Chrissy and Rob and other friends are continually improving the product. Maybe if I manage to get to the end of my session, there will be no more time left, which is what I'm seeing. Have you ever heard of Dba Checks? So Dba Checks is by the same folks who make DBA Tools. And, well, so DBA Tools who don't know, it is for administration, migration, and best practices. But Dba Checks makes sure that you're validating your environment correctly. So it's a set of testing rules to make sure that you're following your best practices. And what's cool is it's based on the Pester framework. So if you've ever used Pester before, it'll be familiar to you. And what I really like about Dba Checks is that it includes visualization with Power BI. It's all built in. And in fact, I've got a screenshot of what that might look like in your environment. That's a Power BI visualization of a Dba Checks dashboard. I stole this from their website, but if I were to create one, it would look very similar to this. So to summarize, before I get to the end of my session, because I think I'm just about out of time. It's just SQL Server. Same code, same compilation. All that they're doing is they're doing some magic to make it think that it's running inside Windows, and then there's a watchdog process to make sure that if it crashes, it can restart. All the things I've shown you except dbfs are not Linux specific. They'll run on Windows as well. So it's just dbfs that is Linux specific. So unfortunately, it's not on Windows. So that was an excellent question as well when you asked it earlier. Everything else works on all platforms where SQL Server is supported. So if you're running SQL Server on Linux, you can connect using whatever client you're used to. Always encrypted works as long as you've got the right drivers. Everything just works. Thank you. Look, there's Tux again. I promise you Tux is on every slide. Any more questions? Yes? The question was, if SQL Server crashes, how can I check what happened? So the answer is, the system controller in Linux has a status, if I can find it here. I think I have it here in my slides. So you see the restart command. You can also do a status here. Let me just, like that. And this is pretty cool. Control U. This tells me that SQL Server is running and which processes are there. And if it's crashed, it's going to show me that it's not running. And there's also a error log file that you're used to using. The error log has 1 through 6. You would just go using your sudo user because you can't get there as a regular user. You would go into the folder and look at the error log file manually. So if it's not running, you would see that it's not running. It wouldn't say active with a nice little green thing. And then you would go into your, do you remember the command? Opt mssql var opt. Opt. Never type in a demo. Sudo ls. So I'd go into the log folder there. And there's the error log stuff that you would be familiar with on Windows. There's your error logs, errorlog.7.8.9. And you can just use the cat command, or you can use more or less, whatever the case may be. Does that answer your question? Thank you. I think we're out of time, but thank you very much for your attendance. Please remember to tell me if I sucked or if I was cool, and why, so that I can be better next time. You can applaud if you like. Thanks, folks.